let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. As many of you may or may not know, my name is Brooks Bonner. I am the Director of Community Engagement and Enrollment Management for the Organization for Tropical Studies. And today we are happy to kickstart our new initiative called Trop Talks, which is a new format where we're going to be sharing a lot of the cutting edge research that's going on in and around our programs and our field stations, both in South Africa and Costa Rica, being done by OTS staff, but as well as people that researchers use our stations, as well as just the broad OTS community. So this first talk today is going to be done by a man many of you know, Dr. Laurence Kruger, who is the Director Curriculum and Program Director for OTS South Africa. He's going to be talking about the elephants of Kruger, which many of you, I think we have a few alumni in this call that probably had some firsthand experience with. But just to give you a quick idea of how this format's going to work, Laurence is going to talk for a while, go through a few slides, and then at the end, there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions of Dr. Kruger. And if you are familiar with Zoom, there's a way that you can raise your hand at the end of the call. You raise your hand, I can unmute you, and you can ask your question in front of the group. If you're feeling shy, you can also put it in the chat space, and we'll try to get to those questions at the end of the talk. So I will, Laurence, if you want to go ahead and get your start sharing your screen, I'll stop sharing mine. We can get this ball rolling.
All righty. How's that? Firstly, welcome everybody. Just nice to see some familiar faces and nice to see some new names. I guess the point of today's talk is threefold. The one is to tell you a little bit about the ecology of management of elephants in the Kruger National Park, but also to speak about the kind of data that OTS students have been collecting over the years. And today's presentation really does focus on primarily on the work that our students have done and the data they've collected and the work we've published. And then also to give the students that are new to OTS just some sense of how your experience in OTS might influence your future careers and so on. And so without further ado, one of the major challenges we face right now in Southern Africa is what we've now termed the paradox of conserving elephants. And so today I'm just going to take you through some of the data where we look at the effects of elephants on biodiversity, and then just how the Kruger managers have responded to these data and how we are managing elephants at the moment. So on the one hand, where elephants are not protected, we see a precipitous decline in their numbers. And the graph on the top left-hand side of your screen, that's a representation of all the major conservation areas in Africa. And those that are colored brightly red indicate declining populations, and gradation through to the bright green, which should suggest increasing populations. And most of the southern parts of South Africa, or southern Africa, would suggest that elephants are doing really well, whereas in the rest of their distribution, apart from blocks in East Africa, not so well. And this is only accelerating for much of Africa, whereas the opposite is happening down south. And the paradox comes in is where elephants are conserved effectively, it would seem that they're now starting to have a negative impact on biodiversity in these ecosystems. And so we'll take you through some of those details as we go now. So all of this is against the backdrop of a global loss of big trees for a variety of reasons. And being a big tree ecologist and a botanist, obviously my first point of departure with a lot of this work would be from a vegetation perspective. And over the years of working with students that are possibly more interested in animals initially, but not by the end of the program, Joey, I've been drawn into some of the biodiversity related questions. But anyhow, so globally we see a decline in big trees due to logging, climate change, land use change, and otherwise. And that's certainly pretty extreme in some of the savanna systems as well. And probably the key bit of work done in the last 10 years was work done by Greg Asner from Stanford, who, while most of us have been doing a lot of field work at a fairly small scale, Greg introduced us to the world of LiDAR, the laser imagery, to assess the change in vegetation across the whole of the Kruger Park. And so I'll just start with some of the fundamentals and then go into some of the details. So why big trees? Why should we bother about this? In the first place, those who know me well have certainly been indoctrinated. But in essence, the largest trees in the landscape would be considered to be keystone structures, keystone species, in the sense that they result in significant resource hotspots. It's a consequence of hydraulic lift from their root systems, accumulating of nutrients through beneath the canopy from litter fall, but also the change in microclimate beneath the tree becomes really important. This has significant trophic cascades. We see shifts in animal behavior in heavily wooded areas. Herbivores prefer the shade and the forage beneath the trees, and some really remarkable work done by Anna Tractor in East Africa has outlined just how important this can be. And there's this positive feedback between animals grazing beneath the improved forage quality beneath the canopy of the trees. The longer they spend in those or beneath those canopies, the more they defecate and urinate. In so doing, you see this positive feedback. And so these, not only is it nutrient rich, but also you typically have far moister soils beneath the canopy of trees. Great deal of work has been done on the link between bird communities and birds. So much like the work done by MacArthur and Wilson and Mark McCody and the forests of Southern Africa, we've started doing that work in the Kruger, and particularly it's some of the work that's seen a lot of attention is the work on vultures nesting in the bigger trees, but of late we also have found some important relationships between vegetation structure and bats. And the small mammal world is a little bit less certain, but certainly it seems that big trees can also influence small mammal communities. And as far as plants go, we all know about shifts in community dominance, and if you lose big trees, you tend to see quite significant shifts in plant communities. And of course, then you see these trickle-down effects. And so, it's images like these that have really got the managers in the Kruger Park and all around Africa quite concerned. So this is actually work done by a sandparks researcher, Holger Eckhart, back in the early 90s. And at the time he was, his work was quite heavily criticized because we felt it wasn't detailed enough. And this is a whole, I think there's some 300 fixed point photographs or fixed point photograph locations around the Kruger Park. And so what he did was, through repeated photography, show the loss of these big trees all across the park. And we criticized him because we felt that, it's a snapshot, it's a very limited view, and who's to say what's happening outside of the frame. And it turns out he was right, and it's just good to see him vindicated years later. But it's images like these that would really get the managers concerned. Another one would be, this is a photograph from the north of the park of a roan enclosure. And this 30-hectare fenced-off area was built to examine why some of the rare antelope were declining in the Kruger Park. So inside this fenced-off area, essentially you only had animals smaller than a rabbit and a roan, no predators, no competitors, but it provided the perfect opportunity for sort of comparative studies, because both sides of the fence burn at the same fire regime, but the only major difference here would be the difference in herbivore densities. And certainly you can see quite a big change or quite a big difference in the large tree density. And the argument is that's primarily driven by elephants. So managers seeing images like this certainly start to become very concerned. And the data emerging from Greg Asner's work certainly supported some of these findings and supported some of these, not fears, but concerns. And this is just the image in the top left is representation of what the data looked like. So they flew 1/10 of the park 3 times, so 2008, 2010, and 2012. And these data are comparing the LiDAR flights from 2008 to the LiDAR flights in 2012. And it's just a before and after image of exactly the same place. And using the laser imagery, you can reconstruct the vegetation structure. And Bree, being a termite biologist, will be very happy about that termite mound, which is also captured by the LiDAR. And in essence, what we found over this period of change, was that there were some 215,000 additions. So places where you see greater vegetation biomass or tree biomass after 4 years, versus over 800,000 individual trees that were lost from these systems. And that represents a significant loss. And that's only 10% of the park, and over a 4-year period. So it certainly would indicate some significant losses. Thanks to some incredible work done by the students. And each one of these slides represents another little element that a group of students has worked on. And the mechanism of this loss is this interaction between elephant browsing towards the end of the dry season and fire. In essence, elephants are mixed feeders. So early in the wet season, they'd be grazers, and this will last until the end of the wet season, when they start switching to forage, so become browsers. They focus on the leaves, focus on the branches, and towards the end of the dry season, particularly in drought periods, they will start stripping off bark to get at the cambium and the phloem. And this image in the top left indicates some recent elephant stripping of an acacia. Then a whole suite of boring insects often will start to penetrate the xylem. Some of the buprestids and the longhorn beetles that I've shown there. They perforate the xylem, and that renders it more flammable. Intense fires might burn through, and then we start to see the effects on the right-hand side. So this is actually one of my favorite marilla trees that has remained standing for about 15 years. So every year I come past and it's burnt a little bit more, and yet it keeps standing. But it's images on the far right that really get people concerned, because adult trees, once they get to about 10 centimeters, are no longer vulnerable to being burnt. And it's only if the bark is stripped that they actually start to burn. And this is some really neat work done by students in the past. So we know that elephants are important, but there was a fabulous opportunity to study the influence of fire. And so strongly encouraged by William Bond, the Sandparks fire ecologist set up an experiment called the firestorm experiment. So most burns, most fire regimes are, particularly in conservation areas or where prescribed burning is important, are relatively safe fires. And what I mean by that is they adhere to what they call the 30-30-30 rule. So 30 degrees, below 30 degrees Celsius, below 30 kilometers an hour wind speed, and above 30% humidity. And that's the same the world around, whether it be in Australia or North America. You typically burn when it's safe. The problem is that your burn regime becomes quite homogeneous then. And the argument is that there are not enough of these cataclysmic fires. So William convinced the managers to set a sequence of burns, and there's a very neat opportunity south of Skukuza, where they burnt in a sequence of 2 fires. In some places they burnt with 2 cool fires, in some places 2 extremely hot fires, hence the name firestorm. In some areas first a cool, then a hot, in others first a hot and then a cool. And so it's a really neat platform for understanding the effects of very intense burns. And so Greg flew with LiDAR in 2010, 2012, and 2014, so to cover those two sequences of burns. And what they found is in a sequence of 2 cool burns, there's only a loss of around 3.5% of the trees over that period, over those 2 fire periods, compared to where they burned twice with very intense burns, where they saw a 35% loss of trees. So it's not only the elephant browsing and the elephant stripping of bark, but it's also the fire intensity that plays a really important role in the declining numbers of big trees in these ecosystems. So where the students really come in, aside from looking at the mechanism stuff, is looking at the trophic cascades, the consequences, the trickle-down effects of the loss of big trees. And we've looked at a variety of scales. We've looked at very small scales in the Sabi River. We've worked in the far north of the Kruger Park, and then, of course, in much bigger scales, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's an extravaganza of biodiversity surveys. So the OTS alum that have worked with me in the past have certainly had to engage in some of this work. We do small mammal trapping, bird surveys. We've done dung surveys in the past, herpetological work, all kinds. As I said, we've looked at all 3 scales: the small, the medium, and the very large. But I'm just really going to report on the fundamental findings of some of the larger experiments. And this is one of the platforms where to encourage, once the students have finished the courses, but to come back and engage in Ph.D. work and otherwise, is this massive experiment that you set up in collaboration with Sandparks, the University of Florida, and the University of Eswatini in Swaziland, now called Eswatini. And it's a comparative research project looking at the southern basalts of the Kruger Park, and comparing that to the northern basalts in Eswatini. And so same soils, same climatic regime, but the major difference is then in Kruger we have all the mega herbivores. And the photograph at the top is an image of the southern basalts, an almost treeless plain, very, dare I say it, Serengeti-like, very much like images out of the Lion King. And then in the image below is what the Eswatini looks like. So same vegetation type, same community dominance, but just vastly different structure. And we've set up 25 research plots in the Kruger and some 54 in Swaziland: birds, bats, small mammals, vegetation structure, vegetation floristics, and a whole suite of other work. And without diving into the details too much, what's critically important for the Kruger Park managers is to maximize heterogeneity, because the argument goes that heterogeneity begets biodiversity. So the greater the heterogeneity in the system, the greater number of niches, and consequently we could that there'd be a greater species diversity. And this is exactly what you found. So over a period of 5 years, we've seen a decline in vegetation structure and heterogeneity in the Kruger. And when we compare it to Swaziland, we see quite a big shift in the heterogeneity. So on the x-axis, we've got this heterogeneity index, and on the y-axis, we've got, in this case, functional diversity. And this is a pattern that you find across all taxa: birds, bats, small mammals, across small, medium, and large scales, not only for species richness, but also the functional diversity. So that the diversity of, in this case, bird functional types. So and these are feeding gills primarily, but the same holds for all kinds of other gills. And what you're finding in the Kruger, which are the beige dots, where mega herbivores are present, we see with this decline in heterogeneity, we also see a significant decrease in functional diversity. And so herein lies the crux. And the key issue around the paradox of managing elephants is, so the elephant population in the Kruger is doing really well, but certainly it's starting to have significant effects on the ecosystem. By reducing heterogeneity, it's also, certainly in the one part of the park, it's starting to have an impact on faunal diversity. Incidentally, what we're also going to do, and this is again just a quick plug for you guys that are interested in graduate studies and otherwise, but you're now also using this as a platform for a number of different PhD and master's programs. And this is Maggie's vegetation recovery. So what we've now done in the Kruger is we've built 9 fenced exclosures, 3 of them full exclosures, which keeps everything greater than a rabbit out of the plots, and then 6 partial exclosures, which just keep mega herbivores out. So we've got these 25 sites, 9 of them have fences on them, and in Swaziland we've got very dense vegetation, as I mentioned, but you're now cutting down virtually a hectare of vegetation in 9 plots. So we're really starting to experiment with savannas now, and just to see how resilient these systems are. Can they in fact bounce back? And Don and I were just in the field this morning, and it's actually quite remarkable to see some of these species starting to germinate in these plots, and the vegetation structure is changing inside the herbivore exclosure plots. But it's not all bad news. Elephants, we know, play a really important role in actually, you could almost argue the conservation of savannas, from facilitating access to water for other herbivores in drought periods by digging holes in riverbeds, through to dispersing a number of different species, seeds across the landscape. And the 2 favorite ones would be Marula and Balanites. And again, this is one of the favorite OTS projects, so looking at plant-animal interactions and species that are dependent on elephants for germination and dispersal. So what has Kruger's response been? Well, in the past, we know about the culling policies that were employed from the late 60s to the mid-90s, and that, of course, changed with the changing politics in South Africa, with the switch to a demographic South Africa. Also saw a significant change in the elephant management policy and the cessation of culling. And this is a graph that was used by the elephant manager at the time to say this alarming increase in elephants. And now in 2020, we see around 22,000 elephants in the Kruger Park. And so like all strongly managed faunal communities, or any population that has been culled usually responds by explosive breeding. And certainly we saw significant increases in elephant populations after the culling era. We also know that they're transported elephants and contracepted elephants. This is just an image of the Transfrontier Park, the brainchild of Anton Rupert and Nelson Mandela. The idea was that conservation knows no boundaries. And so they established what they call the Peace Park system across Africa. And I believe that's now extended globally. And in our case here, they joined the Kruger Park with the private game reserves to the west, and then Limpopo National Park in Mozambique. But also the idea was to create a corridor into Garnet National Park. And it's been very successful. So they dropped almost a third of the fences between Kruger and Mozambique, and some 2,000 elephants have already moved into Mozambique in the last 10 years. So that represents a significant exporting of animals. So these interventions work, but the argument now is that they are running out of space. And so certainly culling has stopped, contracepting was never feasible in the Kruger Park, and they've dropped about as many fences as they can. And there are some challenges now with rhino poaching and wanting to put the fences back up. And so let's talk very briefly about some of the Kruger Park's responses to all of this. So just a little bit about the elephant populations in the Kruger Park. So the elephants of Kruger represent around 4% of Africa's elephants. So actually a small proportion, but they tend to use the spaces more intensely because they're fenced. They tend to breed much quicker. There's plenty of resources in the landscape, and they tend to live longer. Life is pretty easy for the Kruger elephants. And the outcomes have been this higher growth rate, so greater lambda, but also greater density. And this is what has caused most of the concern for certainly the managers, but not necessarily the scientists. So historically, they've been very intensely managed either through culling or being fenced. But because of those self-same fences, their human-elephant conflict is relatively low. And of course, people like to see elephants, which, by the way, is one of the reasons they stopped contracepting elephants in those private nature reserves, because they stopped seeing babies in the landscape, and the tourists demanded seeing babies, so they stopped contracepting. So all of this has resulted in some fairly nervous managers. And so what they've done now, if they've done some really neat work on the influence of resources on elephant population biology. And so one of the key policies that the park is focused on is trying to get elephants to move far greater distances to access water. So they've closed a whole bunch of water points, and Joe, you did some of your work on that. And it's had important effects on elephant breeding. So the suckling calves, if you look at the daily roaming distance on the x-axis and the survival index on the y-axis, it's had no effect. The subadults, those that are between 9 to 12 years, again, there's no relationship between the daily roaming distance and the survival index. But when it comes to their recently weaned calves, you start to see a decline in the survival of these calves the further they have to walk to water. And it's just that they can no longer lean on mom. So they no longer deriving or getting in resources from their mothers, and they just become a lot more vulnerable. And so by forcing elephants to walk greater distances to access water resources, what they're seeing in some parts of the park now is a declining in the lambda, they're declining in the growth of the populations. And there's also emerging evidence now that as a sort of density dependent effect, as the populations, and these are local populations in the Kruger Park, so the greater the density, they're starting to see a decline in the population growth rate as well. So that's a double whammy of not only are we seeing increased mortality because they have to move further, but also as in the areas with the denser populations, you start to see a decline in lambdas. So certainly the reduction in the water points, and as the density of the animals increase, we start to see a decline in numbers. But there's still some concern around the elephant numbers increasing in the Kruger. And herein lies the crux now. So we've done our work in the far south of the Kruger Park, and certainly we're seeing a decline in diversity in faunal communities, which is of course of some concern. And our argument is that we're losing big trees in those landscapes. How Kruger has now then incorporated this into their thinking is the argument that Kruger is massive and heterogeneous. And so while we might be seeing a decline in a small area in the far southeast of the park, we've really got to keep our minds open to what's happening in the rest of the park. So the way they approach this now is monitor the entire park for the change in vegetation structure. And in other parts of the park, we're just not seeing the same rate of decline in vegetation structure. And the argument is, we clearly, thanks to the work done by OTS students and a whole range of University of Florida students, this relationship between vegetation structure and faunal community is becoming clearer. But the Kruger's argument is that the Kruger is massive, it's heterogeneous, the elephant density varies substantially across the park, and therefore the ecological effects would vary. And therefore, you've got to vary the policy. There's no one-size-fits-all policy for the whole of the park. And so at this stage, it's still very much a wait-and-see state. And the argument is that we're not seeing these, the effect that we're seeing in the southern parts of Kruger, we're not seeing it across the whole park. When that starts to happen, certainly we need to start managing elephants. So the response has been stopping the large-scale killing. We've stopped the large-scale removal because we've just run out of space in southern Africa. But they've closed the water holes, they've been blowing up dams. And we've also started consolidating in some of the major areas by removing the fences. And it certainly seemed to be having the desired effect. The challenge, though, is we're still waiting to see whether the effects that we're seeing in the south of the park are going to be seen across the whole of the Kruger Park. And so that brings me to the end of the talk. Just a crash course in elephants of the Kruger and the management responses. And a lot of these data are thanks largely to the OTS courses we've run. So to date, there have been 54 courses in the Kruger, some 690 alumni from the program. And over a quarter of those of you guys, Miranda, breed, have returned to South Africa. And that's the real joy of running this program, is that just so many of our students have returned either as graduate students or as research interns. They've come to do some, or they've come to the OTS courses, been exposed to this fabulous opportunity to engage with some of the top researchers in the country, but also some of the key conservation issues in Southern African parks. So great exposure, great research opportunities, but then the trick is always to get you guys to come back to South Africa. And I guess just to illustrate the kind of effects that this has on people's careers, Steva and Scott were students in the very, very first program, and Carla is now basically built on doing research in the Kruger Park. She's now a professor at Yale and is one of the foremost savanna ecologists. And through the OTS program, she was introduced to Southern Africa, to William Bond, and the rest is history. Scott, we're now trying to collaborate on a human capital development program. He's the director of a program called We Got Next, which is focuses on getting African American, or creating opportunities for African Americans and people of color in the wilderness spaces. He's worked with Knowles and Patagonia on some of these issues, and he's now started his own NGO, and we're hoping to collaborate to pair up people of color from the States with youngsters from South Africa and work in the Kruger Park. And then thinking locally, Melissa has done some remarkable work. She's wrapped up a Ph.D. now, works for BirdLife Africa, and has done work all around Southern Africa on bird conservation. Married to Caroline, who is also an OTS student, who's a postdoc at Wits University. So there are enormous opportunities during the program, but certainly after the program. And it's just great to see the effect that the OTS program has had on people's careers and their and just a brief mention of this relationship that I have with Kruger. We between OTS and Society Trust and Sand Parks, we've formed this organization called the Kruger Science Leadership Initiative, which is this platform for partnering in programs, but also for exchange. And that's the platform that we use to support many of you guys to come back to Kruger. So I think most of the alumni on this talk have actually attended an OTS course, which was based in at the SSLI. But that's where any students coming on the program will run most of the course. So we spend at least 60% of the time in the Kruger Park, and most of that time at the SSLI. And for those of you who are going to come back as grad students, Jessica, we look forward to hosting you here at the SSLI. And that is it.
Great. Thank you, Laurence. I feel like I've seen and heard you talk, I don't know how many times, but each time I do, I still learn something new. So it's nice for me. So hopefully everyone else got something out of it as well. But now that that's kind of over, I want to open it up to questions. Again, you do want to raise your hand, and I will call on you, and you can either unmute yourself or I can unmute you. It looks like Vivian has a question, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and go ahead and answer or ask your question.
Sure. Thank you very much, Laurence. I was just wondering, because we hear most of the time that elephants are ecological engineers or ecosystem engineers, and I was just curious why, in particular, I've seen a lot of elephants, I guess knocking down trees, but I'm curious to know why after the wet season they tend to, they can also, I guess, scar the trees and take away some of their bark. And I'm wondering if there's like a difference in why they do that instead of knocking down the trees completely.
So there's that's actually a good question. We haven't been able to adequately answer it. So the reason they start to scarify the trunks of the trees is they're looking for the most nutritious part of the tree. And so by the time you get to the end of winter, the forage quality of the leaves has declined dramatically. So, and elephants will push over trees, but it's odd that they actually don't feed extensively on the trees. And we've seen elephants push over a tree and nibble at a couple of roots, nibble at a couple of branches and move on. And there's a particularly dynamic scientist by the name of Jeremy Midgley who asked this question as to why elephants push over trees. And he would argue that it's actually got to do with exercise. They're pumping iron. And it's mostly the bulls that push over trees. So when the breeding herds move through, they're the ones that will break branches and strip off the bark. But it's only really the bulls that push over trees, but they don't do it in close proximity to the females, so they're not showing off. And one of the arguments is that actually they're practicing, because when elephant bulls fight, they butt heads. And so one of the arguments is that they're pumping iron, they're getting fit and strong. But there are a range of explanations for it. So sometimes it's associated with feeding, but not that often. And so the stripping of the bark is that they're trying to get to the phloem and the cambium, which is very phosphorus and nitrogen rich and very rich in proteins.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Looks like Joey has a question. So go ahead, Joey. You are unmuted.
Hey, Laurence. Great seeing you again.
Hey, absolutely, Joey.
I had a question that you were talking about, like the watering holes. Have they been closing them down like since I left and with my project? And also, second question would be, how have the like precipitation levels been like since I left? Have they been increasing or decreasing?
Yeah, because you were there at the end of the drought, eh?
Yeah.
So when you were here, they had around 70 water points open. So that's down from the 360 they had built between the 1930s and the 1960s. And they've actually some of those remaining 70 have just simply gone defunct. They just haven't maintained them, but they have blown up quite a few more dams. So don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 2 or 3 of the major dams have been blown up and have been drained, and that was quite a big move on Sandpark's behalf. Interestingly, though, just at about when you guys left, there's real concern around the drought and the impact that was having on the buffalo and the hippo populations, and so there was actually a move to open a couple of water holes just to try and support some of these populations of large ungulates. And so there is still some concern, because there's a fence that prevents the animals moving in an east-west direction to get to some of the permanent water along the Drakensberg escarpment in the west of the park, that they should at least keep some water holes open during these drought periods. But in the last 2 years, we've actually seen pretty good rainfall. So actually the last 3 years, so we had 2 years of sort of average, and then this year we've had exceptional rain. So you actually wouldn't have recognized it. It was just that the grass was tall, hugely productive system. And we had very early rains, we had very late rains. And so actually the argument is that should be very good for some of the woody plants. We should start seeing some of these woody plants bounce back. And I know it's a little bit premature to start talking about those effects already, but certainly we're starting to see a lot of seedlings in some of those fenced-off areas. And so it fits our model, which is ideal.
Awesome. Thanks for answering.
Sure. What would be ideal is if you came back and helped us with that work.
I know. I'm hoping to in 2020 or 2021, when the ban is over, I can come back. That'd be awesome. Looking forward.
All right. So other questions out there? Thanks, Joey. Thanks, Vivian, for speaking up. It looks like we've got another virtual intern that has a question. So Julia, go ahead. You are unmuted there.
Hi, thank you, Laurence, and thank you, Brooks. This is kind of also about the watering holes. You mentioned that with increased density around them, there will be a decrease in population growth. Is that just simply out of competition for resources? And then kind of a two-part question based on that, would you expect the population to decline to the sweet spot or like a carrying capacity type thing and maintain around that, or?
Yeah, it's hard to say. So it's very much a wait and see policy. So I mean, that's what strategic adaptive management is that you effect a management policy, and then you treat it as an experiment, and you stand back and watch just to see what the results look like. And certainly the closure of waterholes is, and it's a density dependent effect, and it's a pattern that's common across most faunal communities, experimentally and naturally. As soon as the animals start running out of resources, you see a decline in their growth rates, and the mechanism is easy to observe, particularly during the drought periods where animals don't carry their babies to term because they lose condition, and it's the same for elephants. And so in some parts of the park, the population growth rate has dropped to around 2%. Elephants are like, they're just the most incredibly resilient thing. So the same rate at which the traffic increases in Los Angeles, which is around 6%, we saw the same rate of increase in the elephant population. So a doubling every 10 years. But that's declined in some parts of the park to around 2%. So the sweet spot is tough. What you really want to, what many of the managers are hoping to see is a decline in the population to the point where you're starting to see a decline in these ecological effects. That sort of, as ecosystem engineers, do we start seeing a decline in the rate of the loss of trees or the impact on other aspects of the vegetation? So we actually don't know yet. We haven't done that work, but at least the trajectory is moving in the right direction. But it's a bit like contraception. You're never going to see a negative, or the argument is it's unlikely to see a negative population growth rate, but we'll see. And certainly that population growth rate just in the last, I think it's in the last 8 years, has gone from 6 to 2% in some parts of the park. So I was skeptical initially, and now the data are starting to show a real change. So it might well work. The question is whether it'll work fast enough to conserve. There's certainly some parts of the park where people are concerned about vulnerable plant communities. So in the far north, the very arid parts of the park where we see most of the baobabs and these big succulent trees, stichulias and comiferas, there is some concern in those parts, and also in the south of the park where it's a lot wetter. We're particularly concerned about those areas. So those would be the canary in the mine for elephant effects. But for the rest of the park, not too bad as yet. The big question, of course, is the biodiversity decline that you see in the basalts. Are we seeing that elsewhere in the park? And not really, not yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good question. Good questions. Anyone else out there? I know we've got a few alumni. I think we've got a few prospective participants in the future. All right, looks like Bree has a question. Bree, you there?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, my question is, can you expand on like what the best timing of rain is for large trees and why? And since elephants are mixed feeders, would they have some kind of best rain regime, since they don't really, if they're not as worried about whether they're eating grass or munching on leaves and fruit from trees?
So the best, so from what you understand, the best for woody plants would be, well, there are two elements. The one is consistent rain throughout the year, and particularly late rain. The germination of the seeds is largely dependent on the breaking of dormancy, and that's whether it's passing through an elephant, or in most cases for savanna trees is moisture. So they need to be buried, they need to be wet, and the seed coat will crack. And so germination is one thing, and it's cued largely by moisture in the soil. But the potential for that seedling, that germinant, to become established is very dependent on late rain. So you need the soil to be very, very wet. And as it starts drying down, if you have another late pulse of rain, it just gives it that extra bit of resources in order for the taproot to reach the water table. So consistent and late rain is important for the establishment of woody plants. But also the argument is that in the dry periods, particularly towards the end of a drought cycle, once the browsers start to decline in the system. So even in this last drought, we only really had 3 intense years. you start to see a dramatic decline in buffalo, wildebeest, zebra populations, but also some of the impala. The idea is that towards the end of a sort of a particularly intense long drought period, you should there might be a window of opportunity for those woody plant seedlings to shoot through the browse trap. This latest drought, and we've tagged a lot of seedlings, and we're looking at the demography of many of these big tree species. The drought just wasn't long enough. So we only had a 3-year period, and we're looking to see what would happen once the impala populations really crashed, or the elephant populations really crashed. Did we start seeing the rebounding of some of these woody plant populations? And the drought didn't last long enough. So when the rest of the country was hoping for the drought to break, we were quite keen for it to last. And as far as seedlings and elephants and seedlings go, I was also very skeptical until I did some field work in the far north of the park with an MSc student who was looking at the fluctuations in the population dynamics of the floodplain forests of the Phaidhobia and fever trees. And we watched this elephant move through a population of seedlings, just literally like one by one, plucking the seedlings at the end of the dry season. So the seedlings is a lot more palatable than the adults, and obviously a lot more accessible. But one elephant ate about 60 seedlings, so literally just picking from there, which couldn't believe our eyes. So they actually do have a big impact, and so much so that between the elephants and the impala, we just see absolutely no seedlings of baobabs in the far north of the park. So elephants can have a huge impact on the seedlings as well.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay.
I thought you were going to ask me a termite question.
I think I got that covered.
You do. Sorry, Brooks?
No, it's all good. It's all good. Anyone else out there with questions for Laurence? Now's your time. Now's your chance. And actually, it looks like we've got a question here in the chat from Miranda. She asks, how is the park management taking into account how these changes, whether that be the water hole closures, changes in fire management, removal of earth dams, and changes in plant homogeneity, affect other vulnerable species in the park other than elephants?
So that's a bit of a tough one. So Kruger's decided to adopt a landscape or systems ecology approach to the management of the park. And some parks are very focused on individual species. So if you go to Botswana, it's still very species-specific conservation, but the Kruger policy is largely driven by maintaining ecosystem integrity. And their key metric would be heterogeneity. And And the argument that we make in a lot of the work that we're doing is that by elephants depressing vegetation structure, we've seen this trophic cascade and the potential loss of vulnerable species. The park has, the managers and the research scientists in the park haven't seen that across the entire park as yet. And as soon as they start seeing that, then you're likely to start seeing more significant elephant management. So I think the feeling is that while we're starting to see local influences, so the elephants feeding on succulent trees in the far north, you're starting to see an extirpation of those species in parts of the landscape, but they do have refuge in very, very steep parts, very steep slopes on the top of mountains and so on. And so, that was raised as a flag some 10 years ago, but the argument is that most of those species are still fine. There are no red data species or particularly vulnerable species that are currently a threat by the elephant effects and so on. So until that happens, we're not likely to see that trigger response from the conservation managers. But I think in some parts of the park, they're starting to feel like we should at least start thinking about managing. And so they're testing all kinds of management techniques, the use of chilies, which some of the OTS students have done, the use of bees, which another group of OTS students have done. There's also disturbance culling. There are all kinds of interesting ideas around using irritating noise of subsonic irritant noises to keep elephants out of areas. So the landscape affair becomes an important tool in this instance. So they certainly started to trial some of those thoughts. And interestingly, human voices are the key instrument in this landscape affair idea. So we've looked at chilies, hasn't really worked. We've looked at bees, didn't really work, and it can't really work in a place like Kruger. This is too big. And so what some of the researchers are now thinking about doing is broadcasting human voices, and that certainly has traction. So in other parts of South Africa, just north of Pretoria, and close to Polokwane, they're finding that if you play human voices, particularly people who've been in the landscape for millennia, so mostly Nguni-speaking people and Nguni voices, languages, elephants flee the area, and so they're starting to think about using that in both rhino management and elephant management. So rhino management because they want to keep rhinos out of the poaching hotspot areas, and they want to keep elephants out of some of these areas where communities are vulnerable.
Very good. Very good. For those of you that didn't see, Don Tai shared a resource for an article relevant to some of the elephants in Kruger as well in the chat window, so take a look at that. I think we have, Laurence, I know you could keep going, but I think we have reached the end of our talk here. Great job. Thank you everyone for joining us. We realize that, you know, these are challenging times for everyone, and we do appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. We've recorded the talk today. We will share it with everyone who's registered, so if you want to rewatch something, you can. We'll also be sharing it on our social media accounts as well at Tropical Studies. And we hope to do more of these in the future. So few of you alumni that are out there listening, you know, if you've got some really cool, you know, cutting edge research projects that you've, you know, either done with OTS or it doesn't even have to be with OTS, but since you're alumni, we'd love to hear more about what you're working on. We'd like to do more of these. And we hope that the OTS community, as broad and far-reaching as it is, would be willing to share some of your research or some of your work. So Laurence was happy enough, lucky enough to be the guinea pig today. So I want to thank you, Laurence, for doing this. We know that it's almost 1 o'clock there in South Africa, so I guess we'll let you go to bed. And thank you again to everyone for joining us, and stay safe.
Nice to see you all. Cheers, guys.